Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you for joining us. I'm so glad to have you here and to be able to share some of the work that I've been doing on the early years of the university. So tonight's talk is about the founding of the university, so it will have a very 1920s flavour, but I hope you'll come back to us in future months to hear more about the later history of the University College and University as well. So what I do is work with the university's archives, its archivist and its special collections team. And I'm going to talk about how we're doing this research on our history. I'm going to give you some background on why a university was set up in Leicester to begin with, what the educational background was to all of that. I'm going to take a look at who our founders were, who the people were who thought that scheme should go ahead. And you may have heard of the university being referred to as a war memorial university. So I'm going to talk a bit about its foundation in the wake of the First World War and mention some of the World War I casualties that donations were made in memory of at the time. Then we're going to look at who the first staff were, how they set up departments and how they turned what was an empty shell of a building into a college. And also take a brief look at some of our first students and what life was like for them in the early years. And then I'm going to mention our 100, which Rachel mentioned in her introduction, because I hope this talk will stimulate some memories for you and you might think of things you can nominate for our showcase and our memory bank, which we're keeping open for the centenary year. So researching the history of the university, I do this mainly using what we call the ULA series. This is a sneak peek of the strong room in the library basement, particularly looking at the institutional archives. The university archives, just as some background, if you didn't know, holds at the last count over 1,044 linear meters of material. That's 6,300 archive boxes. And the ULA series, which is specifically the institutional records, amounts to 422 linear meters of shelving, or that is more than 2,500 boxes of material, much of which has not been explored before. Some isn't even catalogued as yet. There's work to be done on the university archive. So I had the exciting task of delving into boxes and finding things for the first time in a while. And also before lockdown, I had been going around campus to try and find archives that we didn't yet know about and we don't yet hold within the archive. So I've been trying to sniff those out as I went along, because there are things in filing cabinets and cupboards that get forgotten about or are at risk when someone retires or someone relocates. So we've been trying to salvage what we can, because archives are never complete. They're reliant on what gets donated to them. So, and memory, of course, is what we need more of in the archive. So I have been recording some interviews with people whose association with the university really helped tell its story. So why was a university set up in Leicester? Well, this slide, I'm afraid, has lots of text on it because I just wanted to emphasize that it seemed to be a movement really that started with calls being aired in public in Victorian Leicester and gathered momentum in the 20th century as the needs for school places, scholarships and higher level training seemed to be on the increase. And as you can see from some of these items, there were various other educational establishments and learned societies being founded in the Victorian period. But when we come to the 1880s, we have three successive presidents of the Literary and Philosophical Society, all of whom start arguing that either the Literary and Philosophical Society itself or Leicester as a town should really start offering higher education, because there weren't enough opportunities to keep people who had intellectual interests, potential, or training needs, indeed. So the Reverends Joseph Wood, James Went, and J.D. Paul all make this argument. But a key moment for us really comes in 1912, when a local man, a doctor called Astley Clark, this is a photograph of him from the archives, he, in his presidential address to the Lit and Phil, really starts to argue that now is the time we should make this happen. We've been talking about it for a while. We want this to go ahead. And I've also got a picture of the front cover of the transactions of the Lit and Phil, in which Astley Clark's presidential address is recorded. This is his own copy of it, which we have in the archives. And in his speech, he said, quote, "I look forward to the time when Leicester will not be content without some university college or university in its midst, where the various branches of knowledge will have a fitting home and the institution be a part of Leicester's daily life. The need for such a college is still more shown when one considers the facilities which are afforded to the so-called working classes to continue their education," i.e. there were very few, and Astley Clark was aware of this. Now, he was a man of tremendous energy, and he did his homework. He knew what the educational needs of the town were, and he knew where university education was at in the country. And we're very fortunate to have this in the archives. This is Astley Clark's own scrapbook, showing it before and after conservation. It's now sort of deconstructed and massive, but it's protected. And this is this contains a history in itself. All his clippings and correspondence relating to the conversation around having a university are in this scrapbook from at least 1910-ish through to the days when the college opened. So some of you, if you're medical people, might recognise some of Astley Clark's training there in his bookplate. Oakham School as well, I think. So here we have Astley Clark. On the need for university education in the town, he realised this overlapped with the needs of secondary level teaching. There were some very, very good schools in Leicester at the time, and they were training pupils up to University of London matriculation standard, but then if they wanted to go to university, they'd have to leave the town and go elsewhere. Astley Clark was also keen that Leicester have a medical school, and he did try to found a medical school as early as the 1920s. We didn't actually get it till the 1970s, but there was medical teaching going on under the supervision of Astley Clark. But as I say, he was a very practical man, and he knew that, for example, in 1911, there were 25 pupils from Wigston Boys' School who had passed the equivalent of the University of London matriculation, who had no university to go on to. He knew what was going on at the universities of Manchester, Birmingham, and Sheffield. But when he first spoke about having a university, there were only 5 in the country at the time. So he turned to experts for help, one of whom was Holford Mackinder, who had recently founded the Reading University College. Astley Clark, during his presidential year, arranged for Mackinder to come and speak to the Lit and Phil Society in 1913, but unfortunately Mackinder couldn't make it. But fortunately for us, that means he sent his speech in typed form, and we have this in the archives as well. And in this, he strongly advocates that what you really need to found a university is strong leadership and strong finances. Well, I suppose 1 out of 2 isn't bad, but he also advocated that you avoid limiting the teaching to the immediate needs of the town's businesses, because what Astley Clark and others who were supportive of the university scheme were doing was going around the town to its prominent and wealthy businessmen saying, look, the university could be such a useful thing to your industry. We'll make sure that it includes training in your area. And I suppose Mackinder was just warning against narrowing the aspirations of the university if they did limit the teaching to technical training. So he was quite long-sighted about that, and that was quite useful, I think. Just a couple of clippings here from later on, 1919. Before things started happening, there had been talk of an East Midlands university, so a kind of a regional scheme to plug the gap of higher education in sort of Leicester, Derby, Rutland, Nottingham area. Now, Nottingham already had a college and was very keen to become the centre itself, but eventually this plan falls by the wayside because Leicester didn't want to be an outpost of a Nottingham-centred scheme, and it didn't want to be restricted to being a centre for industrial training. It wanted to widen the range of teaching it could offer and the range of audiences it could offer it to. This is quite an important article. I'm sorry, it's very small writing, but this appeared in the Leicester Daily Post in 1917. It was written by the editor, Walter Gibbs, who we'll come back to. And this is apparently the moment in which the idea of a university college, which had had to go on hold during the First World War, was revived again in 1917 towards the end of the war as being a great thing to aim for as a form of war memorial. So this is where the idea of raising money for a war memorial and the idea of having a university in the town really meet. And Astley Clark writes back into the paper, as do other supporters of the scheme, and Astley Clark within this says, now every material asset a person possesses may flee. Education alone is an asset of which an individual cannot be robbed. Let us therefore offer higher education as our war memorial. And this seems to grab people's imagination. And even the Leicester Mercury, who's always less effusive in its support for the scheme, couldn't deny that the psychological moment, as they put it, seemed to have come for having a university in Leicester. So who made this happen? Apart from Astley Clark, who were our founders? Well, I want to emphasize that the founders weren't just the people who gave money. They were entirely reliant on donations, but they were also entirely reliant on people's ideas, their contacts, their expertise, their volunteering, getting hands-on, joining committees in governance and finance. There was in fundraising, there were all sorts of ways in which people made this happen. And notably, they very early on recruited support from civic leaders of the time. So I've pictured here the Duke of Rutland, who was succeeded by his son on the college council after he died in 1925. There's Admiral Beatty, who when asked by Astley Clark, probably wrote into the papers to support the scheme, and then two of Leicester's mayors, Jonathan North and Councillor Lovell. And also at the bottom, we've had support from the first female councillor on the City Council, Ellen Swainston, the wife of the High Sheriff, for example, Mrs. Hawley, and another councillor in the centre. Those with a kind of central or ceremonial civic status, those who would attract attention and be good champions for the scheme. They were fashionable or municipal figureheads whose authority could really influence the progress of the scheme. And there was also a lot of interest and commitment from people in education. So I've included here pictures of E.E. Lowe, who was the director of the New Walk Museum, and F.P. Armitage, who was the first director of education since January 1919, and also Margaret Vaughan, the widow of Canon Vaughan, who had founded the Vaughan Working Men's College, and Sarah Heron in the oval-shaped frame, who was the head of Wigston Girls' School. And also a clipping of support from Florence Rich there, who was head of Granville School for Girls. Dr. Simon Dixon has looked at some of this and writes that it's noteworthy that 3 of the first 5 Daily Post correspondents to write in favour of the university plan were women, including 2 local school mistresses. The first of these was Florence Rich, principal of the Granville School and one of the first women admitted to study science at Somerville Hall, Oxford in the 1880s. Sarah Heron was quoted as having said, "Many girls are tied to their native town in order that they may give help and companionship to their parents." And that was particularly the case after the First World War. So these headmistresses realised that this could be an important moment for the higher education of women who might otherwise not be allowed to leave home. Other networks were really important to the founding of the university. So I've mentioned Walter Gibbs, editor of the Leicester Daily Post. He's shown at top left there. And he eventually we'll return to him because he becomes the University College's first secretary, a role we now call registrar. Next to him, two more local doctors, Colonel Charles James John Bond and Dr. Bennett. We'll come back to the Bennett family as well. They made 2 of the first donations to the University Appeal. And at the bottom, we've got people representing religious networks. We've got Canon MacNutt of St. Martin's, which is now the cathedral. Canon Thompson Elliott, who was Vicar of St. Peter's and a prominent Rotarian, and also bottom right is Robert Fleming Rattray, who we will return to. He was our first principal, or became so, and was a minister of the Great Meeting, the Unitarian Church. But there was also a lot of support coming from Rotarians, Soroptimists, the female equivalent, from the Caledonian Society, the Chamber of Commerce, and the National Union of Women Workers. All kinds of networks helped to spread the word. And there was notably support from some quite prominent women in society, particularly those who had an interest in the education of girls or the education of those with learning disabilities. So I've chosen to show here at top left Gertrude Vincent, who was one time mayoress when her father was mayor. She lived at Knighton Hall, which some of you will know later becomes the residence of our principals. But she was a campaigner and a good public speaker. She helped us to raise funds for the university, and she was also one of the first women on council. Next to her, Annie Clefan, a name you might know because there's a Clefan building at De Montfort University. Her father supported the arts, and she did as well. She was also very keen on women's suffrage and the education of girls. And on the bottom row, I've pictured Lady Fair, who was president of our Bazaar Committee, which in 1922 raised over £15,000 for the university. And next to her, Agnes Evans, again, a local headmistress of Belmont House School and a rare female president of the Literary and Philosophical Society as well. I've also shown a picture of Isabel Ellis, of a prominent local family who wrote into the papers very early on to support us. Crucially, though, we did rely on support from wealthy and influential local businessmen. So here I've shown top left Thomas Fielding Johnson, who I'll come back to. He was a worsted manufacturer. Next to him, Thomas Hatton, who, as we'll see, makes a large donation to our library. Also William Tyler, in whose memory a Department of Commerce was going to be set up. And at top right, Harry Hardy Peach, who ran the Dryad Works. I love Harry Peach. He's a great character and features so strongly in the early history of the university. And I think he really did a lot to contribute to the spirit of the institution. On the bottom row, we've got Harry Simpson G, who was head of Stead and Simpson, you might know the footwear manufacturers, Sidney Jimson of the Jimson and Co Engineering, local again, and Sir Samuel Fair of Fair Brothers Shoes. We also had support from Frank Moore, the president of the Chamber of Commerce, and also from Leicester Law Society and Medical Society. So all kinds of champions from these areas of city progress. Here are just some clippings from our press cuttings books, which show how the college scheme really aimed to try and help almost every trade or area of industry that they could name check, really, to try and get people on board. So this is all while they're trying to fundraise and get pledges of money. But there is still a debate about whether to have a college or not at this point, and whether it's a good thing. But generally people are supportive, at least the people we've got evidence of their views for. This is another local doctor, Dr. Finch, who kind of introduced a turning point for us, in that he had left a bequest of £5,000 to the corporation, so long as they took it up within a year of his death for the purpose of founding the university. And eventually the corporation decides to accept that. So as well as accepting the money, they were accepting the responsibility to bring about the university. And thoughts had turned to where that might be. And there's a large public meeting about it. And this site, which at the time had recently been used as the 5th Northern General Military Hospital during the war, gets mentioned. We'll come back to this because it was originally built in 1837 as a county lunatic asylum. This lovely drawing from 1890 shows it when it had expanded massively back from the facade, and it was getting sort of full to bursting, and its facilities were a bit obsolete. Eventually the asylum was moved to a new purpose-built building elsewhere. And this was left empty, and it didn't sell, but then it was requisitioned and became a military hospital. And that will have been very, very well known to Astley Clark, who as a medic had a role at the hospital during those years, so he's familiar with the building. Thomas Fielding Johnson, who I mentioned before, decides he's going to take action, and he, in 1919, spends £40,000 on this building and the site around it, expressly for the purpose of handing it over as a gift for the university scheme. So he buys this in secret, and then he lets Astley Clark know about it, and Astley Clark says, we've got to rush off to the mayor and tell him you've done this. So this is a copy of the letter that was given to the mayor to announce this purchase, and this is the site. So as you can see, he intended it not just for the university, but for both of the Wigston schools. The Fielding Johnson building is the shaded footprint within the red section here. What's labelled as Victoria Road, we now know as University Road. But this also shows a lot of temporary buildings that were put up during the war in the blue section. That would eventually go. The Wigston Girls' School had a purpose-built building shortly after this time. And the press celebrated this purchase by saying how magnificent a gesture it was. As you can see here, they're calling it a princely gift and lining it up with other figures from the annals of Leicester's history as being really important. And people get to know that once this gift had been made, there is a site, there is an appeal fund. It looks like things are really going to happen. So this draws in further support and further donations. And a plaque was cast to commemorate his gift. This is still in the foyer of what we know as the Fielding Johnson building. This was unveiled so that nobody would forget his generosity, and it also helpfully lists who the trustees of the Fielding Johnson Trust were that made sure his wishes were carried out, because he died not long after. So the appeal opens and is going well. They thought they needed to raise £150,000. Now that they had a site worth £40,000, their aim was for £100,000. And sure enough, more and more donations come in, some of which are in memory of people affected by the war. So we have a combination of in memoriam gifts and also thank offerings for peace. And so one of the special items that we have in the archive is this. It's known as the Golden Book. It always was. The university was keen to acknowledge every gift that it received, and had an offer in May 1921 from the principal of the Leicester Art School, Mr. Roberts, that his staff would, to quote, design and make a golden book for the college. In this will be inscribed records of gifts in cash or kind with the names of the donors. And that goes ahead, and we have this lovely thing in our collections. And just to show the first couple of pages inside it, you can see some of those early donations, the first being by Dr. Astley Clark and his wife himself on Armistice Day 1918. Then Dr. Bennett, Mr. Hancock and Miss Humberston also make some of the first donations, and they continue to come in thick and fast. And you can see at the bottom of the first page, for example, that Mr. and Mrs. Ellis make their donation in memory of their son Oliver of the RAF killed in action. So to complement that, we also have an item called the Memorial Portraits Book. This lists the in memoriam and some other gifts from local people as well. But this includes some First World War casualties in whose memory donations were made. So I just thought I'd show some of these, because the pages are written out really nicely, and we have some rare portraits of some of these casualties. Bryce is a big family name locally. There's a Bryce Memorial Hall that was also built in his memory. Arthur Edward Davis, a Leicestershire cricketer, Royal Fusiliers, was killed. Garth Smithies Taylor, who transferred to the Sherwood Foresters at the time he fell in 1916. Oliver Ellis, whose donation we just saw from his parents in the Golden Book, went missing. David Coster Royce, killed in Mesopotamia. And then brothers Edward Wood Leonard, missing after Passchendaele, and Samuel Frederick Leonard, killed in action 1916. And in accordance with sort of popular feeling, a plaque was cast to commemorate some of these casualties. This wasn't actually unveiled until 1931, and then later in the 30s, a second plaque was cast for other casualties, following a bequest which gave a donation to the college on condition of this other plaque being put in place. So those two war memorials are still in the foyer of the Field and Johnson building. And so we had the beginnings of our lovely Leicestershire and Rutland University College, as it was originally known. We've got this lovely postcard in the collection, and I suspect this was a bit of artwork by a School of Art student. So we'll move on to looking at our first staff and the challenge they had in setting up, transforming what was a shell of a building, a former hospital, into a campus. Everything had to be done voluntarily so far. So all the committees, the support from the newspapers, the literary and philosophical and other local societies, town and county figures who helped to represent them. Everything was in the mix, but it was all philanthropic really at this point. So the first thing they needed to do was get organised. So the first member of staff is Walter Gibbs, a lovely drawing of him here by a student that appeared in the student magazine The Wave in 1929. Gibbs gave up his role as the editor of the Leicester Daily Post to join our staff. And he had an immense task and workload in what he did. And very sadly, in 1929, Gibbs took his own life on the campus. He actually lived on the campus as well, in a cottage that's no longer there. But Gibbs, owing to family problems, workload issues and mental health problems, yes, he took his own life. And it was said in the annual report after his death that the college has sustained an almost irreparable loss in the death of its first secretary, the late Mr. Gibbs. His devotion to the interests of the college was wholehearted, and he spared himself neither the time nor trouble in his services in its behalf. And I think it's true that if anyone can be said to have given their life for having a university in Leicester, it was Walter Gibbs. But he came on board as our secretary and our very first member of staff. Joining him was Robert Fleming Rattray, who was appointed the first principal before Frederick Attenborough, who follows in 1931. It's largely due to Rattray that ensured the survival of Vaughan College by absorbing it into the Young University College as an extramural department. He was a Unitarian minister. He'd been working in Liverpool and then moved to Leicester in 1917. He was quite outspoken when the University College was proposed, particularly in arguing against that narrowing of the curricula to the immediate industrial needs of the town. But it was his overall responsibility for turning the empty hospital into a building fit for a university college, which is no mean feat. This sketch drawing that we have on the left is the only image that we have of exactly how they tried to plan the use of the main building from the beginning. So an honorary architect had been appointed, and the college founders started to think about how to adapt these rooms for starting to teach. They wanted to open as soon as they could, but only parts of it were made ready for opening day. And there was still no central heating until the following year. So his poor early students would have been cold all the time. These quick drawings show how rooms around the centre front of the building were to be used. And I've just done a close-up of the ground floor plan, which you might be able to tell where the entrance to the Fielding Johnson building is. They'd actually planned to have a classical portico in years to come, which never came off. But it's interesting to see how they used the rooms initially. So this is what the entrance and the first floor landing of the Fielding Johnson building looked like in 1921 when the doors opened. These feature in the first prospectus, and it's likely that everything you can see in terms of furnishing and fittings in these pictures will have been given or loaned. Right down even potentially to the plant in the plant pot. We were really hand to mouth and reliant on people's generosity. Fortunately for us, we had a very artistic mind in the form of Harry Hardy Peach, and he donated some artworks and many art prints that eventually go on to decorate the campus. And we needed a coat of arms and a motto. This is a copy of the coat of arms that we have on vellum in the archives, and I believe this was probably done for Principal Rattray when he left in 1930. He left it to one of the first students, Nellie Bonsor, and I believe this is probably that very copy which she then subsequently left to the university. So the symbolism of our coat of arms is explained as the open book symbolises the seat of learning, and it has our motto on it. One of the cinquefoils represents the city and the other the county, the horseshoe representing Rutland. The demi-griffin surmounting the crest of the design is taken from the arms of Thomas Fielding Johnson in recognition of his gift of the site. And there ensued a debate about adopting a college motto when this was all beginning. And as you can see from the university minutes there and some press cuttings, there were lots of suggestions from local people. It was Dr. Rattray who suggested ut vitam habeant, or that they may have life, a biblical quotation, which is the motto eventually adopted. But we have lots of other suggestions there, including some Shakespearean and many in Latin. But it's quite interesting to look through some of those because they express how what people thought the university's mission should be. Here is our motto carved beautifully in ivory in the back of the ceremonial chair that sits in the council chamber, and just a clipping from the minutes showing the official adoption of that motto, and also that the college colours were decided on as maroon and green. Some of you may remember that from blazers, if there were still blazers when you were at the university. How do you furnish an empty shell ready for teaching? Well, you need a library, and Thomas Hatton, who I showed a picture of earlier, gave one of the major gifts to in the form of a library. In fact, a large topographical library in particular. It was made up of thousands of volumes, and this formed a core part of the university library for many years. In fact, in the first year of being open, the library only actually purchased about 10 books or something, because it had had so many donations from local people. And some people did regularly give volumes as time went on, but this was a particularly large gift, and it was celebrated by the production of book plates to identify books. And I actually noticed, zooming in on this photograph, that you can read it says Hatton Library. This photo's from the 1930s, and up there it says Hatton Topographical Library. So they did try to keep this particular section of the library together, and we still do today. This was the large council room, and we know that the Rotary Club paid for some of the panelling here, as did a private gift. The chairs were gifted from the recreation hall of the military hospital. They belong technically to a different building on site. And the platform table and ceremonial chairs in the distance there were also a gift, and are hugely significant because they're Jimson designed. And this is a suite of Jimson furniture that we also still have in this same room. Hasn't changed much. We call it the Jimson room now. It's quintessentially Leicester. This, by the way, is a peek at the library on the day that we opened. It's the only picture we've got of what the very first library looked like. And those wooden shelves were cobbled together by hand by Dr. Astley Clark, by recycling coracles that had been used by soldiers at the military hospital previously. It was renovated by 1923, however, following an appeal. So a quick look at some of our staff and the departments they set up. Miss Measham, who taught botany. They appear to have recruited mainly women, mainly part-time on short contracts, and mainly from local grammar schools, because they had to try and get teachers in at short notice. So there was a lot of big borrowing and stealing going on. But in the second year, they appointed Miles Thomas, Ethel Miles Thomas, a quite brilliant botanist who also taught zoology for a while. Both of those women helped to set up the first botanical gardens that we had in the 1920s. Geography was taught by Miss Gladys Sarson, who stays on as an assistant tutor for quite some years to come, but was sort of replaced by Patrick Bryan in the second year. He's a big figure in our history because he stayed for so long. If you remember Pat Bryan, do tell us what you know of him. He headed geography and commerce. He's the man who employed W.G. Hoskins, and he also played a number of important roles in university governance. And our first music tutor in the first term was Dr. Malcolm Sargent, a name you might well know because of his subsequent fame. His career was on the rise at this point. He'd been the organist at Melton Mowbray Church, but he did go on to co-found the London Philharmonic and was chief conductor for the London Proms from 1948 to 67. And he taught music at Leicester University College in 1921 to 1923. Mr. Buckler, who taught history, stayed for about 5 years, and Mr. Rhodes taught maths. Initially, maths was taught at the Technical College, but we did eventually get a proper lectureship. Mr. Leon taught classics, and he's another figure who stays for a long time. He was the son of Romanian Jews with a BA from New College, Oxford. He actually married another member of staff who we'll see shortly. Yeah, he was with us for a long time. He didn't retire until about 1960. He married Marietta Soman, who taught French and German. She'd had a distinguished career, including during the First World War, for which she was awarded an MBE. She attended the Peace Conference in 1919. But it seems, to the university's shame, that some of the governors decided that when she was married and expecting a child, they would try to replace her. So she was effectively forced, I think, into resigning because she was pregnant. In order to open physics and chemistry departments, in other words, to expand the science side of the college, an appeal was needed. So they knew that setting up laboratories was expensive, and they aimed to raise £20,000 for this, which they did. And that enabled them to employ Louis Hunter, another man who was on the staff for 40 years. He was still there till 1965. He equipped the labs. He wrote a history of the chemistry department in 1955. And we have some things in his own hand about his First and Second World War activities and those of the department. And these are his labs. And they were also able to take on a physicist, A.C. Menzies, who stayed for about 9 years. It was really hard to find a photograph of him, but here he is on the right there, in a slightly blurry, very small photograph. He'd come from Cambridge. He was described as a rising young physicist with a range of teaching skills and very inventive in terms of new experiments. But he was also keen on developing sports and social activities for the staff, for the colleagues, so bringing the staff socially to life. And this was a view inside the physics teaching spaces in, again, the ground floor of the Fielding Johnson building. So here is a timeline of the pre-war departments, just to give you an idea. They tried to recruit someone to teach commerce in 1920 because of the Tyler bequest, but they couldn't actually find someone to fill that post. But then, as you can see, it's quite hard to determine as well, what is a department and when can you say it have been founded? Is it when it's being taught? Is it when there's a building? Is it when there's one full-time staff? Is it when there's more than one staff? Anyway, you don't have to worry about those things, I do, but this is what it seems to look like. And though we don't have a medical school until the 70s, there was training in medical studies, nursing and midwifery and pharmacology right from the early years, really. That's not shown on here. There's also an emphasis on adult education and on education, so training teachers. Teacher training was an early interest as well. So I wanted to finish with looking at a few of our first students and what their life would have been like. This is what they would have seen on the first day. So we believe that on the first day, 9 students started the first ever class at 10 o'clock in the morning on Tuesday, the 4th of October. For the first year, we think there were actually 11 students and 4 part-time ones. The figures are difficult to make sense of, but we think 11 students. And we knew that from press reports about the announcement of the opening, classes were being held in English, Latin, French, geography, botany, maths at the technical college, and students were being trained to post-matriculation standard. We know that there were delays in getting the building ready due to what they describe as labour difficulties. So the buildings weren't quite ready to be seen by the public, but they were keen on opening to the public so that the people of the town could really see the value of the University College. Now, here are a couple of photos that showed what your living would have been like if you were a female student. If you were male, you had to find lodgings in the town, but girls could apply and pay to stay in a hostel, which was on campus in a building it's not there anymore, but it had been nurses' accommodation during the First World War. It was a strip that used to run from where College House is across what we now call Centenary Square. So this is a student's room and sitting room in that block. This is the first ever sort of class photograph that we have. Interestingly, we don't have the original, we have a print. So this was taken in the summer of 1922, and this is the reason we think that some people repeat that there were only 9 students in the first year, because there were only 9 in this photograph. But as I said, we do think there were 11 day students and a further 4 part-time students. But here we have it with only 3 of the staff members in the photograph as well, all managing to fit around a bench. Miss Measham, I think, is on the left, and we've got the principal Rattray and Walter Gibbs again. But I'm going to look at just a few of the girls in this photograph now. So here they all are named, and there were six other people as well. Rhoda Bennett, top left there, I'll pick out. She was the daughter of F.W. Bennett, who'd made one of the earliest donations to the University Appeal. She'd got a place to go to St Hilda's College, Oxford, but felt that she couldn't leave home so soon after the First World War. So she's an example of someone who benefited from a college opening locally because she was unable to move away. She got her bachelor's in history in 1925, but she returns in 1931 as our librarian. And she, along with her sister Hilda, gave over £20,000 to the university, and they left their home on Regent Road to the university as well. And as librarian for 30 years, Rhoda Bennett saw the library through the Second World War, through some of the leanest years the university had, until it started to receive grants from the government. She was the librarian who employed Philip Larkin, the poet, from 1946 to 50. And indeed, the Bennett building on campus is in part named after Rhoda. It's also named after her father and sister in recognition of all the efforts of the 3 of them. Gwyneth Smalley, at the top right there, is another one to mention. She did English. She became a teacher, and from 1945 to 66 was the headmistress of the Warwickshire Preparatory School in Leamington Spa. She was a lifelong friend of Rhoda Bennett, and it's thanks to Gwyneth Smalley that we have some more candid photos of Rhoda Bennett and Gwyneth on holidays and things like that. In 1986, Gwyneth Smalley gave £10,000 to the library, which was the largest ever gift it had received at that point. And when she retired, she became a counsellor. She also accompanied Rhoda Bennett to an oral history interview that we have in the archives. So we actually do have Rhoda Bennett's voice on tape when she was older, and I think possibly suffering dementia, and Gwyneth Smalley supported her right through, and her voice can also be heard on tape. Nancy Capey at bottom left there attended the collegiate school and is an example of a girl who wouldn't have gone on to higher education if it weren't for the encouragement and support of her headmistress. She took French, and we know that she went on to teach in Stockport and then New Zealand. and she also worked as a clerk in later days. They managed to catch up with Nancy Capey in 1971 when we had our Golden Jubilee, and she recalled playing hockey, but not because she was good at it, but because anyone who could play was in the team, never mind merit. And she noted that playing badminton in very low ceilinged rooms was something of a challenge. And then finally, bottom right, Nellie Bonsor. Nellie Bonsor, I'll just show her, we've got her student record card. We have these for quite a lot of them. She was from Wigston and got a scholarship to come to the university. And as her student record card shows there, she was the first president of the Students' Union from 1923 when it started through to 1926. She stayed on for an extra research year. She was very popular and hardworking. And we also know that she stayed in touch with the college for some time to come, and we have photographs of her attending alumni events in the 1930s, garden parties and that kind of thing. And we know she later worked for the RSPCA after also having taught in New Zealand and volunteered for the ATS in the Second World War. And just to give a very brief flavour of student life towards the end of this talk, this was the first ever Students' Union report, which talks about the Ents Committee, the dramatic and debating societies, and says it's significant proof of the vigorous development of the Students' Union of the college that its second birthday was celebrated by the inauguration of a French society and the launching of a magazine. And this magazine that you see here was originally called Leicester University College Magazine. This is the first issue. It became known as Luciad, and we believe that this first issue was edited and probably written by hand by C.P. Snow. And it's magazines like this in the press cuttings which tell us about the activity of the Dramatic Society. Principal Rattray was very keen and got involved, wasn't afraid to put on a costume and play a part, and was a keen advocate for Shaw, saying Shaw was better than Shakespeare. There are some sometimes scathing reviews in the press about some of the students acting, but they enjoyed it nevertheless. We know what the Debating Society was up to. Interesting that its first motion was that war is more stimulating in its effect on a country than peace. And I couldn't resist putting one of these in. This is a page from the Wave Review, another student publication, and this really encapsulates life as a student in about 1930. So it tells us what was going on with the chess club and the hockey team and the formal dances that were often held in town. Here's a view of the rock garden from about 1924. When this was set up. This is the first botanic garden before they moved properly to Oadby. This is on what is now the site of well, the VIP car park, really, if you know where our entrance one is, and the security building. This is just looking the other way from that direction. This is a page from the annual report that records the first degree, which was awarded to Percy Agar, who got his history BA Agar. He came first alphabetically, so the first degree awarded gets noted. The first main year for the graduations was 1924-5, of course, and you'll see names like Bonsor and Bennett in that list there. So to wrap up, I'm just going to show some pictures of class photos through the 20s to give you an idea of how things were expanding. 1924, you can see more staff, more students. 25, 26, 27. You know, CP Snow on the bottom left on the end of the row there. But by 1957, 30 years later, the numbers are completely different. We had less than 200 students until 1946, but by the late 1950s, we had almost 1,000. So it's really post-war that numbers sort of explode. That had doubled again by the mid-1960s and again by the mid-70s. We currently have around 20,000 students, so the growth has been quite exponential. And I think that generations that came later still owe something to the fact that the First World War drove a concentrated effort to bring higher education within the reach of those who might not otherwise have benefited from it. They've lived a more fulfilled life because of it, as I think the first principal Rattray foresaw when he suggested that they may have life as the university's motto. That's the end of my talk, but I did just want to mention how you can help us, which is by taking part in our 100 if you possibly can, going to our website where there is a very simple nomination form. We want you to tell us what you remember, who was important to you, the places you recall, what would you like us to showcase during the centenary year. We've got till the end of March to accept nominations, so please visit that website if you can, and make a nomination. They're all welcome. I've got an example of one that might be familiar to many of you. Nominations for the Paternoster have been coming in a trickle, people having vivid memories of it taking courage to use the Paternoster, because they went around frightening people that you had to jump on and off, and what would happen, would you go upside down when you got to the top, etc. The Paternoster is very well loved, and that's been nominated several times. So my question is, what do you remember and what would you nominate? Here are some further examples. And thank you for listening. I hope you've learned something about our early years, and that you'll come back to learn more about our subsequent decades as we start to commemorate the centenary later this year.
Thank you, Liz, and I'm sure everybody agrees that it's been really interesting and fascinating to understand more about those really early years in the university's history. So we're going to take some questions now, Liz, if you're ready. Just a few, and then we'll wrap up the event. But there were a couple of people, Liz, asking about relatives of the original founders, and if we've traced them, how they're connected to the university, and still and if they'll be involved in our centenary celebrations. So if we can start there.
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really nice that we are still in touch with descendants of some of the founders. So for example, descendants of Astley Clark himself, Percy G, who was another of our big founders. We managed to make more contact with descendants recently for an event we held, a kind of reminiscence event about some of the founding families, and met people from all over who had some things in their personal collections that related to the founding years, which was great. So we are still in touch with some of them. We'd love to hear from more. We've made some connections with the Peach family recently, we had some volunteers do a project on links between the Dryad works and the early university college. So Harry Hardy Peach's descendants are now in touch. So we've collected a few more as we've gone along, but I hope very much they'll be involved during the centenary, because they're often the ones who can supply candid photographs or personal insight into what the people were like, and how that contributes to what we know about the efforts they made on behalf of the university scheme. Oh, Rachel, you're on mute. While you're on mute, I'll just mention as well that Astley Clark's great grandniece graduated in 2018, which was really lovely, and a link straight back to 1918 when Astley Clark opened the Appeal Fund.
Thanks, Liz. Yes, that was a great story, wasn't it? I just wanted to come in on that around the question specifically around the centenary celebrations, and will we be involving descendants of the founders in those? And yes, the answer to that question is we absolutely hope to, and we'll be reaching out to them and hope to involve them in our centenary celebration programme. So on to the next question, and you talked a bit about Rhoda Bennett Liz, and how she was related to one of the founders. Do we know, have we tracked down how many of those first students were related to the donors, and were there any other connections there that we're aware of?
Had a look, yes, and I suspect some of the founders were quite keen to send people that they knew to the university. They wanted it to be a success, obviously. So yes, Rhoda Benton is the daughter of a founder. We know that other of the first students were connected more distantly. So I think, for example, one of the founders had a niece who came from a different part of the country to study and stayed in his house while she was at the university. So I think some of the links were quite close, but they were very keen from the outset to offer scholarships, and that enabled some people from slightly further afield or who didn't come from those wealthy backgrounds to be able to attend alongside them.
Thanks, Liz, that's great. Next question, really interesting one actually. Do we know when international students first started to come and study at Leicester?
We do, and in fact I forgot to point it out on the photograph. In the 1923 class photograph, you could see at the back a Japanese student. He was our first, I think, from 1922. So literally the second year we were open, we had an international student, possibly accompanied by an international tutor as well, member of staff. So it does go back almost to the very beginning.
Wow.
But numbers of international students don't start to go up significantly until post-war.
Sure, understandably, but great that it's. I wouldn't have realised it was that long ago.
I know. We took refugee students as well from various parts of Europe and so forth during the 1930s, and then particularly during the Second World War. So yeah, being a university of sanctuary, that was a way in which we supported international students early on as well.
Brilliant. Another really good question. Where do the Attenboroughs fall into all of this? So I know you referenced the Frederick Attenborough as the second principal, I think, but can you elaborate a little bit more on that?
Yeah, so the Attenborough era, if you like, is from about 1931 to 1951. That's when Frederick Attenborough was principal, and the family moved in initially to College House on campus, and then subsequently after 1946 to Knighton Hall. So the three Attenborough boys grew up on campus, and David Attenborough would run around collecting newts for Anne Hosker, the botany tutor in the 1930s. It's where Richard, we believe, formed some quite close links with the English department and was very interested in drama, and subsequently film from that. So yes, it was 1930s and 1940s predominantly. And I was thinking earlier how extraordinary it is that I thought I was covering, pre-living memory in this talk, 1920s and 30s, but actually the one known exception to that is in the person of David Attenborough. He came in 1931, so David Attenborough has 90 years of living memory of Leicester. That is the longest memory we've yet found.
Yeah, and obviously David does continue to be really well connected to the university, and there is a subsequent question there in the chat around will David and other Attenborough family members be involved in the centenary celebrations, and our hope is absolutely that they will, because as Liz says, it's such a long-standing connection to the university. It would be remiss of us to not try to involve them in some way, I think. Another really interesting question is when was the last entry made into the Golden Book? What time period does that actually cover?
Oh, good question. I think it tailed off, actually. I think possibly in the 1930s, about 1930s, probably when the last ones are written in. I'm not sure why. There might have been another document lost to us where things were subsequently recorded, or it might simply have been the case that there were too many really to keep up with. I'm not sure, whereas in the early days it was very important to pick every every gift and donation out individually. I'll have to check on that one for you. So come back for more if we're doing future talks, and I'll give you the answer.
Thanks, Liz. John Flynn is asking if he can ask a question. So John, are you still with us? And if so, then do please unmute your microphone and ask Liz a question directly. I'm sure she'll be happy to answer.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. Hi, Liz. Sorry, I'm only on audio at the moment. I don't have a camera on this computer. But you mentioned C.P. Snow a few times, and I know, well, we all remember him as the novelist. But in fact, his degree was in physics, and he went on to do a PhD in physical chemistry, I think it was, Christ College, Cambridge, specifically spectroscopy. I just wondered, does he appear in the history of the university subsequent to that? Does he ever come back to Leicester in any capacity?
He does, yeah, because he was kind of a claim to fame given his sort of meteoric career. So he was a Leicester boy, went to the Wigston Boys' School. He came to do chemistry under Louis Hunter, who actually recalls him, I believe, in some old video footage that the Media Archive for Central England holds, and he writes about C.P. Snow's his time as a student as well. We know about C.P. Snow from the University College magazine, but because he went on to be famous, he was asked to come back and reminisce now and then, which he did, or he would send correspondence, and the university subsequently gave him an honorary degree as well. Nobody could decide whether that should be a science or arts degree, and eventually they landed on, I think it was politics.
Thanks for that. Cheers.
Same with Malcolm Sargent, actually. Malcolm Sargent very kindly sent a baton to the Students' Union when he was very, very famous in the 60s and 70s to auction off for rag. So yeah, other of our claims to fame were kept in touch with.
Brilliant, thanks Liz, and thank you John for that question. It's nice to hear you even if we can't see you, so thanks for joining us this evening. I think we've just got time for a couple more questions. There's lots that come through, so apologies if we haven't been able to answer your question tonight, but there's a lot of interest around the first students, and so we'll just do a couple more, Liz, and then wrap up. But Valerie's asking, when did female students stop having to wear the soft caps, which again is an interesting one, I think.
Yeah, and it's one I don't actually know the answer to. I'm not sure. There were various debates that get documented surrounding student dress and whether they had to wear it off campus as well as on campus, the gowns, and whether they had to wear those and when they would only wear them for academic occasions, and when they had to wear them around town as well. I don't actually know with the soft caps when that stopped. Possibly the 30s. We know that 1930-ish, 31 is when female students are allowed to smoke as well as male students. There's vigorous debate in the 1950s about whether female students should be allowed to wear trousers or not. Yeah, so there's a lot of interesting debate around student clothing, but I don't actually know when the caps finally disappeared.
That's fine, that is putting you on the spot slightly. And so we'll make the last question then. Who was the first PhD graduate student and how much do we know about them?
That's a good question. I believe it was either Gertrude Clamp, who went on to, well, she was the first student to secure an academic post, but I'm not sure whether her PhD came from us or not. The first PhD was actually to a member of staff, I believe, who got their doctorate while working for us. But it was quite possibly C.P. Snow in chemistry, actually. Yeah, we didn't have very many research students to begin with because as such a young institution, they weren't sure what teaching capacity they had and lab space for research students. But very small numbers of them were kept on, partly through to the generosity of those who provided scholarships. So we do know that C.P. Snow was certainly one of the first, if not the first, PhD given to a student.
Brilliant. It never ceases to amaze me, Liz, how you can pluck these names and dates and all manner of facts out of your brain. So thank you so much for answering our questions this evening, and for joining us tonight. I'm sure everybody will agree it's been a really fascinating talk, and I've personally enjoyed it, and I hope that everyone else has too. So please do complete the evaluation form that will be shared with you, everyone. That really helps us to understand how we can improve these events and make them even better. And we really hope to see you at another Festival of Change event very soon. But yeah, if I can just thank Liz one last time. Thank you for being with us, Liz, and for delivering such a great talk tonight. Thank you everyone for joining us. And we hope to see you soon. Thank you.